Now, as hard as it is to believe, another year has come and went, and 2024 has been a spectacular year in video games. Well, it has been for me anyway, and it's time for my 2024 Game of the Year awards. And if you're interested, you just wait until after these. Now, before we get started, let's get one thing clear. This is my Games of the Year awards for 2024 and not yours. So if this list doesn't quite match yours, please don't worry about it. Everyone's entitled to their own opinions when it comes to video games, and yours are just as valid as mine. And before we get on to the main event, I'm going to talk about a couple of things that didn't quite make it onto the main event. And also, as per usual, when it comes to my Game of the Year awards, it's going to be split into two. I'm going to give you my top 5 backlog games that I played this year and my top 5 new games. But before we delve into those top 10 games, I would just like to make a couple of honourable mentions to games that didn't quite make it onto the list. Firstly, a backlog game that didn't quite make it onto the list but definitely deserved to be up there amongst the contenders was Disco Elysium. Now, this is a game that has basically flown under my radar since it was released, but given the opportunity to play it thanks to PlayStation Premium, I finally downloaded the game and gave it a fair shake. And if it hadn't been for the sterling competition that it was up against, this could easily have made it into my top 5 backlog games of 2024. It's a wonderful point and click RPG, and there's something I thought I'd never say in my life that is worthy of anyone's playthrough. Also, for my new games that didn't quite make it onto my 2024 top 5 list, we have Persona 3 Reload, and I know a lot of people who know me and have followed the channel will be quite surprised that an Atlas game, especially in the Persona franchise, didn't make it onto my top 5 this year. That's enough of the honourable mentions, so let's move on to the main event, and we're going to start with my 5th favourite backlog game of 2024, and that game is Triangle Strategy.
A new future is before us, a bright future.
Today, we fight not for glory or pride, but for survival, for the future.
Now, you can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I believe this was the very first of Square Enix's HD 2D games. And of course, what will be no surprise to any of you out there watching this, it's an RPG, more specifically it's a JRPG, and it's a tactical turn-based at that. Now, don't get me wrong, this game was a bit of a slow burner, and a lot of people out there who might abandon a game after 2 or 3 hours if it's not quite grabbing their attention, well, this game might not grab your attention in the first couple of hours. But what I can guarantee is that if you do stick with Triangle Strategy, you will have experienced one of the best tactical turn-based JRPGs that has been released in a very long time. So Triangle Strategy coming in at game number 5 for my backlog. Sit it right there and move on to my first new game for 2024, making it onto my Game of the Years, and that game is quite a surprise, I would imagine, for some people. Alone in the Dark.
Have you found anything strange going on here?
Yes. Uncle?
Now, this game really did take me by surprise. Now, many people might remember the original Alone in the Dark, which many people say is the beginnings of survival horror, and that game on the PC back in the early 90s was, well, let's just say it was fairly rough. But as of late, developers, for some reason, and I hope they continue this, have decided to reimagine, remaster and remake older games for newer systems. And 2024's Alone in the Dark is a prime example of why developers should be doing this. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the actual games other than recommending them because they're obviously in my games of the year, but I will happily say that the reimagining of Alone in the Dark is one of the best reimaginings that I've came across since this new trend has started. So if you're looking for a modern take on an old classic survival horror game, then you could do much worse than Alone in the Dark. It definitely deserves a place in my top 5 of new games for 2024. We'll sit it down there and move on to game number 4 for my backlog games of 2024. And that game is a port of another older game, because it's Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, which you can see here in the box art. And yes, I played this on the Switch.
In the end, you belong to neither the light nor the darkness. You will forever stand alone.
Now, I know a lot of people might be surprised that this is the first time that I've played through Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, not only being a video game fanboy, but also being a Star Wars fanboy. The thing is, a lot of Star Wars games leave a lot to be desired, and it leaves a bad taste in my mouth when I play a bad one. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, however, is one of the good ones, as you can see here, making its way on to game number 4 of my backlog games of 2024, and I honestly wish I had played this back in the day. Anyone who's avoided or not played Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, then definitely get yourself down to your local game shop, try and get a copy of it, whether it's original or maybe on this wonderful collection here, but it's a must play and definitely worthy of my 4th best backlog game of 2024. Which leads us on to my 4th top new game of 2024, and a lot of people are probably going to be surprised that this isn't higher in the list, because that game is Final Fantasy Rebirth.
What happened to this place?
Now, Final Fantasy Rebirth is a game that I've been wanting to play for a while, and for a while I mean from the very second that I'd finished Final Fantasy Remake, because I really wanted to see where they were going to go, not only with the story, but with the world of Final Fantasy VII. Now, as many of you will know, the Final Fantasy franchise is one of my all-time greatest franchises, and yes, it's a surprise to have this here. Now, the game does do some very good things, especially when it comes to the graphical fidelity. Seeing all the towns and cities in Gaia in full HD, fully realised rendered 3D graphics was absolutely wonderful. There are a few things for me personally that have dragged this game down in my rankings, and most of that is down to some of the fluff and padding, the mini games that they threw into this game, extending it out far greater than it needed to be extended. And not only that, it's not wholly true to the original Final Fantasy VII story, which is a bit of a shame, but they didn't want to do the same thing again. Again, that goes down to naming this Rebirth. It's worthy of a play. If you've never played a Final Fantasy game before, then you could start with these. If you, like me, absolutely love Final Fantasy VII, consider it probably the best game ever made, then it may disappoint you just slightly, but it's still worth the play, and I've got it here as my 4th top my 4th top new game of 2024, and yes, I did expect that to be much higher myself. So for the sake of space, let's just lie these down here and here as we get ready to move on to the top 3 games of both my backlog and new games for 2024. And of course, we're back to the backlog game, and this is a game that probably not a lot of people will be surprised to see it on here, but surprised that it's a backlog game. But there is a reason, because my 3rd best backlog game of 2024 is Like a Dragon, The Man Who Erased His Name, or Like a Dragon Gaiden.
もう自分の過去も人生も名前すら捨てている。死んだはずの男だ。
Now, of course, the reason it took me a while to get round to The Man Who Erased His Name is that it didn't get a physical release over here in PAL territories. I had to get mine from Japan, thank goodness for Play Asia, but as soon as I could get my hands on a copy, I got it in, I played it, and this game is spectacular. Now, you really have to play this game in between Like a Dragon, so the first Ichiban story, and before Infinite Wealth, which is the new Like a Dragon entry. You need to play it in between those two games because this game is just fantastic, and it's one of the rare examples, and probably the only one I can think of, that's an actual paracle in video game narrative history. And by paracle I mean a game that's not a sequel or a prequel. It runs side by side with Like a Dragon. If you are a fan of the Yakuza games and you haven't quite got round to The Man Who Erased His Name, it's an absolute must play. And if you haven't played the Yakuza games, then you go out there, you pick up 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, Like a Dragon, The Man Who Erased His Name, and of course Infinite Wealth, and you will absolutely have a whale of a time. But The Man Who Erased His Name is my third best game or backlog game of 2024, and it would have made my proper game of the year maybe last year. Unfortunately, I didn't get to play it. But let's move away from the backlog and back onto the games released this year, and my third best game of 2024. And again, this won't surprise a lot of people except maybe the positioning, because we have Ayuden Chronicles 100 Heroes, and this is definitely a game that I've been waiting for a very long time.
Look, you've got ambitions. I understand that. But my situation's changed, and I have to leave through that gate.
It's over, Noah. Accept it.
So long, in fact, I've been waiting for it ever since it was announced on Kickstarter, because as many people will know, this is a spiritual successor to the wonderful and one of my favourite of all time games, and one of the best series in video game history, the Suikoden series. Now, Ayuden Chronicles does take a lot from Suikoden, and that's quite simply because it's a Murayama game. The creator of Suikoden, who was obviously far too fed up waiting for a new Suikoden game to be announced that he could get his teeth into, that he decided to go on and create a brand new game. And yes, a lot of it does feel like Suikoden 1 and 2. It has a lot of the same elements, but a lot of improvements too. Now, don't get me wrong, when you're comparing the likes of Ayuden Chronicles to Suikoden, you're looking at two very different eras, but both the feel and the gameplay in Ayuden Chronicles definitely stand shoulder to shoulder with the original series. Of course, we did have the sad news that Murayama passed away before the game got its official release, so it's unlikely that we'll see much more from this franchise. But it was definitely a worthy song from him, and Ayuden Chronicles 100 Heroes definitely deserves to be in anybody's top list and even top game this year. For me, it's coming in at number 3, and that's simply because there was a couple of more games that just pipped it to the post. But let's move on now to my number 2 backlog game of 2024, and it's a franchise that I've never dipped into before, and it's Ys 8 Lacrimosa of Dana, and this game truly did take me by surprise. Now, as I said there, that I've never really dipped into an Ys game before, and that's quite surprising considering that I'm really heavily into my Japanese role-playing games. Of course, you also have to remember that I'm very heavily a Sony pony, and the Ys games weren't exactly Sony fodder back in the day. Lacrimosa of Dana, however, absolutely blew me away when I played it. The story is fantastic, the gameplay, despite not being turn-based, is also fantastic. The art style I absolutely love, and I enjoyed this game so much I have now started dipping in and buying the previous Ys games and looking forward to buying the future Ys games. And where some people might have thought that The Man Who Erased His Name might be above Lacrimosa of Dana, for me, well, the whole thing that just elevated it that bit much more was how much it drew me into a whole new series of games to get my teeth into. Now, I don't know if they're going to be as good as Lacrimosa of Dana. I don't know if that's going to be a one-hit wonder for me, but even if it is, it's worthy of my number 2 backlog game of 2024. But let's move on now to my top 2, my second best new game of 2024, and it's probably not going to surprise many people. because it's Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, the second mainline story of Ichiban, and of course we have Kiryu in this one too for a good part of it, and what a game.
お初にお目にかかります。手前小国と発しまするはジャパンの東京カムロ町。町のソープで産湯を使い、姓は春日名は一番。人呼んで浜の英雄と発します。奇妙な縁持ちまして、生き別れの母のためはるばる海越え国越えてやってきましたホノルルシティ。
Now, unlike the original Yakuza games, these are turn-based combat and not the action combat that you got in the original games. And yes, Like a Dragon, the first one, was the Yakuza game that dragged me into the franchise. I have went back, I have played them all. I played 0 through to 5, all in the space of 2 months, which was absolutely crazy. I then took a short break and played 6 and Ishin, then of course caught up with Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth. And the cherry on the cake was the backlog game of Like a Dragon, the man who erased his name, which so far brings me fully up to date until the best news that I heard this year is that Goro Majima Yakuza Pirate in Hawaii will be out early next year, and I have a whole new Yakuza game and it stars Goro Majima. But back to Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, absolutely fantastic. Again, it ties up Kiryu's story quite nicely in a proper handoff to Ichiban, but of course in true Yakuza style it leaves it just a little bit open so they can do what they like when they want to do it. But I'm looking forward to further games with Ichiban. He's going to carry the Yakuza games with absolute honour, and in any other year that would have been my game of the year for 2024, however it wasn't. But before we get there, we get to my game of the year backlog edition, my backlog game of the year, the best backlog game that I've played in 2024, and a drum roll please, as we have Parasite Eve for the PlayStation. And yes, it's been far too long sitting on my backlog. Now, not physically sitting on my backlog because Parasite Eve did not get a physical release in PAL regions back in the day, but I have had this game for well over a year now, courtesy of 2 wonderful people over in Canada. You know who you are. I'm not going to continue to embarrass you by mentioning it again, but I was gifted Parasite Eve for the PlayStation, and it was a game that I was absolutely dying to play for years upon years. And is it worthy of all the other backlog games that I played this year to be my number one? And absolutely yes. And why? Because this game was absolutely ahead of its time. It was a survival horror game, it was a JRPG, and not only that, they ditched tank-based combat to move in a full 3D world, which was something at the time we didn't think they could do. Now, don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of limitations to the game because of the time it was released. The backgrounds are pre-rendered like Final Fantasy VII and Resident Evil, but the scope of the movement that they managed to get into these backgrounds with non-tank controls 3D movement, which was such a delight, I can't go on about that enough, was just absolutely mind-blowing. And well, it would have been at the time, and considering that Parasite Eve 2, a game that I absolutely love, is not a patch on the first game, well, that just absolutely speaks volumes for the original game. I wish they had went on in that style. They didn't. I don't know why. You would have to ask Squaresoft. But Parasite Eve for the PlayStation is absolutely the best backlog game that I've played this year. And pound for pound, taking into consideration the era of the game, it quite possibly would be my game of the year. It's not, however, because it's a backlog game, and we have to move on now to the main event, the best game of 2024, and that for me, without a doubt, is Metaphor ReFantasio.
It's a story about a world very different from ours.
'Tis a world where all people are equal and no conflict exists, much like the world His Highness once dreamt of.
To put it another way, this is a fantasy.
The fool of a king is dead!
Without an heir to wear the crown, what will become of the royal magic?
This game was absolutely robbed at the Game of the Year Awards. Now don't get me wrong, it lost out to Astrobot, and you know what, I'm a Sony pony and I like it when Sony win, but I don't think a cutesy action platformer, no matter how good it is and no matter how many member berries are in there for us Sony fans, that it holds a candle to Metaphor ReFantazio. Now Metaphor ReFantazio, for anyone who doesn't know, is the new Atlas pillar. Atlas, of course, are two main pillars of Shin Megami Tensei and Persona from that series as well. They wanted a third one, something slightly different but something slightly the same, and that's exactly what they've done with Metaphor ReFantazio. What we've got with this game is it's something special because it takes a lot of elements from SMT and of course Persona, sort of blends it together. They add the fantasy narrative in rather than, they tend to go more with contemporary narratives, but for this fantasy narrative, a lot of blending of mechanics from those two main series, and they have got an absolute winner on their hands with Metaphor. I am looking forward to seeing what they can do with this. There's plenty that they can do with it, there's plenty to go on with it, and just what a game, what a story, great mechanics, great look, great soundtrack, great everything. It did win Best RPG at the Game Awards, it won Best Story in RPGs or even video games in the Game Awards. How it didn't get the Game of the Year award is a travesty, but it's getting it here. Metaphor ReFantazio, best game that I played this year, and yes, I'm going to compare it side to side. This is a better game than that, only technically, but by age. That just blew me away. But let's give the flowers here to Metaphor ReFantazio and Atlas, and this is going to be great. We're going to have a Shin Megami Tensei game, we're going to have a Persona game, and a Metaphor game to look forward to. And the more games, more RPGs from Atlas that we have to look forward to, the better. And that was my Game of the Year. So there you go, my friends, that was my Games of the Year for 2024. And what did you think of those? Any games in there that you've played this year? Any games in there that maybe have sparked your imagination and you want to go play them now? Or any games that you would like to see fired into the sun and forgotten about for all time? Just drop down into the comments and let me know, because interaction between you and me, well, that's what makes YouTube special. It does for me anyway. Thank you very much for watching, especially if you've been with me all year or maybe for the past 4 and a bit years. And until next time, of course, lang may your lumreek and cheerio.